All right, folks, buckle up because today we're diving headfirst into some really heavy stuff.
Yeah, this one's gonna be a tough one.
Social media, cultural clashes, and the legal battles that can happen when those two worlds collide.
Exactly. Those intersections are fascinating. But man, are they complicated.
And our starting point, well, it's a tragic story. The story of Hira Anwar, a 15-year-old Pakistani-American girl killed by her father.
Oh, yeah, in Quetta, Pakistan, right?
That's right, and the alleged motive, her TikTok videos.
It really highlights the tension that so many immigrant families face.
Yeah, especially when you have traditional values clashing with what it's like to grow up in a Western digital age.
Like, how do you balance those two worlds?
Exactly. And on top of all that, we're dealing with accusations of an honor killing, which just adds another whole layer of complexity to it all.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good reminder that these issues aren't just theoretical, you know? We're talking about real lives, real families.
Right, real people caught in the middle of all this.
Yeah. Yeah. And to broaden our perspective a little, we're also going to be looking at Sai Pavuluri, a Chicago man who was arrested by ICE.
Yeah, shortly after he finished serving time for a DUI fatality, right?
That's it. And he was here on a student visa at the time of the accident.
So his story brings in the legal system, cultural differences, and raises questions about what justice really means in these kinds of situations.
For sure, both cases are incredibly nuanced. You know, we've got a lot to unpack here.
We really do. So let's start with Hira's story. I mean, it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is.
Here's this young girl, born in the U.S., living a pretty typical American teenage life, active on TikTok, the whole nine yards.
Like so many kids her age.
Yeah, but her family had emigrated from Pakistan, and they reportedly held on to very traditional values.
What's really interesting to me is that the family had actually lived in the U.S. for about 25 years.
Wow, really?
Yeah, before moving back to Pakistan.
So they weren't just on a short visit or anything.
Nope, they had resettled there, which makes you wonder, how much did they really assimilate during all that time in the U.S.?
Right, and how much did that impact Hira growing up? Was she caught between two worlds?
That's a great question.
Because her father, Anwar ul Haq, reportedly saw her TikTok videos as, quote, objectionable, and said they brought shame on the family.
And that's where this idea of an honor killing comes in.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are familiar with the term, but it's worth really digging into what it means.
For sure. It's not just about someone feeling like they've been wronged. It's about control, a whole patriarchal system where women are seen as extensions of the family's honor.
So basically, in this case, Hira's online presence, especially on a platform like TikTok, which is all about self-expression, may have been seen as a direct threat to the family's honor.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tragic situation, and unfortunately, Pakistan sees hundreds of these honor killings reported every year.
Wow, hundreds.
Yeah. And experts believe the real number is probably even higher because of underreporting and, sadly, societal acceptance.
It's hard to even imagine.
While Pakistan has made some legal changes, like closing a loophole that used to allow families to pardon the people who commit these crimes, the question is, how effective are those laws when cultural norms run so deep?
It makes you wonder if simply changing the laws is enough, or if it takes a much bigger societal shift to really address this issue.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Legal changes are important, for sure, but dismantling these deeply ingrained cultural beliefs and practices requires a much wider, more systematic approach.
So what, like education?
Exactly. Things like education, empowering women, and encouraging open dialogue that challenges those harmful norms.
Basically creating a culture where women are valued as individuals, not just for their connection to family honor.
You got it.
And that brings us back to Hira. She represents this clash between the freedom of self-expression that we often associate with Western culture and the strict expectations that can exist in more traditional families.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that social media can almost act like a catalyst in these situations.
I'll say.
Well, it gives people a platform for self-expression, which can be incredibly liberating, but it can also be potentially dangerous when it clashes with deeply held family beliefs.
Almost like social media pours gasoline on a fire that's already been smoldering for generations.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so speaking of different kinds of fires, let's switch gears and talk about Sai Pavuluri.
Yeah, his case is a whole different ballgame. Arrested by AC after serving his sentence for that DUI fatality, it brings up a lot of questions about immigration enforcement in the U.S.
Especially because he was here on a student visa at the time.
Right.
And it's interesting that the victim's mother in this case, Wendy Howard, had mixed feelings about it,
Oh, yeah. She said she forgave Pavuluri for her daughter's death, but she also agreed with him being deported.
which just goes to show that these situations are rarely black and white. There are so many emotions, legal considerations, and societal values all tangled up together.
Absolutely. And Pavuluri's case raises some bigger questions, too, like how does the U.S. approach immigration enforcement?
Right. Are we too focused on punishment instead of rehabilitation?
And is deportation always the right answer, even for people who've served their time and are trying to rebuild their lives?
It seems like a system that's often driven by fear and wanting to punish people
Mm.
rather than truly understanding what each person's situation is.
It often lacks that nuance, yeah.
And we should remember, Pavuluri's arrest wasn't just a random event.
No.
It was part of a larger ICE operation targeting immigrants with criminal records.
And these mass deportation efforts have gotten a lot of criticism because they're so broad. They often end up catching people who've served their time for minor offenses or don't really pose a threat to society anymore.
So basically, you have a system that sometimes prioritizes just enforcing the rules, regardless of individual circumstances.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of collateral damage comes in.
Meaning what?
When you cast a wide net, you inevitably catch people who might not deserve to be treated so harshly.
So it raises questions about whether we're being fair, whether the punishment fits the crime, and whether we're really upholding the values of justice and due process that we claim to believe in.
It's a good question. Are we really achieving justice? Or are we just creating more fear and punishment, especially in immigrant communities?
Definitely something to think about as we delve deeper into these cases.
For sure. And it's a question we'll keep exploring as we move forward in this depth dive.
I'm sure we will.
Yeah, it's going to be a long one.
You know, it's easy to focus on the legal stuff,
Right. The laws, the court cases.
but I think we need to remember the human side of these stories.
For sure. These are real people's lives.
Families being torn apart by these tragedies.
And they're caught in the middle of these huge cultural and legal systems.
Exactly. And with Hara's case, I mean, I think for some people, this idea of an honor killing might seem totally foreign.
Yeah, like something out of a movie or something.
But to really understand it, we have to look beyond just the act itself.
We got to look at the whole society that makes this kind of thing possible,
So these deeply ingrained patriarchal systems.
where a woman's behavior is seen as a reflection on the entire family's honor.
So it's not just about someone feeling wronged. It's about maintaining control.
Exactly. It's about control in a system where women are often denied autonomy and seen as like vessels of family honor.
Rather than individuals with their own rights and agency.
Right, their own choices.
Which is such a contrast to the individualistic values we often see in Western society.
Where personal freedom and self-expression are so important.
Yeah, you're encouraged to be yourself.
And this clash of values, well, it becomes even more obvious in the age of social media.
Because everyone's putting themselves out there online.
Platforms like TikTok, which are all about self-expression and challenging norms, they can become these flashpoints for conflict.
Especially within families that are trying to balance these totally different worldviews.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
So you have someone like Hara, growing up in the U.S., exposed to all this freedom and self-expression online.
But at the same time, living under the weight of her family's cultural expectations.
It's almost like a recipe for disaster.
And that's what's so tragic. She's stuck between these two worlds.
Trying to figure out a path that honors her own identity while still respecting her family's traditions.
It's a balancing act that ended with devastating consequences in her case.
Which makes it even more clear how important open dialogue and understanding are. Both within families and across cultures.
If we can't bridge those gaps, these clashes are just going to keep happening.
Okay, so shifting gears to Sai Pavuluri's story.
All right, let's jump over to that.
We see a whole other side of this cultural and legal complexity playing out.
This time within the U.S. immigration system.
Right, his arrest by IC after he served his sentence for the DUI fatality.
It sparked a lot of debate.
Some people saying it's necessary to protect public safety.
Others saying it's way too harsh, especially since he already did his time.
And it's interesting, the victim's mother, Wendy Howard, she had this really nuanced perspective.
Yeah, she forgave him, but also felt deportation was the right thing to do.
Which just goes to show you, these situations aren't always clear-cut.
Not at all.
There's so much emotion involved, plus all the legal stuff and societal values.
It's all tangled together.
And Pavuluri's case brings up these bigger questions about how the U.S. handles immigration enforcement.
Are we too focused on punishment instead of rehabilitation?
And is deportation always the answer, even for people who've served their time and are trying to turn their lives around?
Tough questions.
It feels like a system that often prioritizes punishment and retribution.
Yeah, instead of taking the time to understand each person's individual circumstances.
And remember, Pavuluri's arrest wasn't an isolated incident.
It was part of a much bigger ICE operation.
Targeting immigrants with criminal records.
And these mass deportation raids, they're incredibly controversial.
Because they often lead to people being detained and deported who don't actually pose a threat.
People who might have done something minor years ago.
Or already served their time.
Right, and suddenly they're caught up in this system.
Which brings us back to this idea of collateral damage.
When you have these huge sweeping policies, you're going to have unintended consequences.
Impacting innocent lives.
Like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, you might get the job done.
But you're going to cause a lot of unnecessary damage in the process.
So it brings us back to the core issue we've been talking about.
This balance between justice and accountability.
With compassion and understanding.
How do we create systems that address the harm?
Without just resorting to punishment all the time.
It's a question that requires a lot of soul-searching.
Both as individuals and as a society.
Okay, before we move on, I think it's worth looking a bit closer at what Pakistan has done legally to address honor killings.
Okay, yeah, let's dive into that a bit more.
We touched on it earlier, but I'm curious with the specifics.
Like, have they actually made any progress in dealing with this deeply rooted issue?
Because it seems like such a huge problem.
Well, back in 2016, after the murder of Quandil Balak, who is a social media star, by her own brother.
That was a big story.
The Pakistani government actually closed a loophole that allowed families to pardon the people who commit these honor killings.
So before that, families could just forgive the killer.
Yeah, essentially.
Wow, that's a big change.
It was a huge step. It showed that they were serious about holding people accountable, even if they're family.
That sounds promising, but like we said before, changing the laws is one thing.
Changing how people think is a whole other challenge.
Are these laws actually being enforced?
That's the tough part. The laws are there, but enforcement is still inconsistent.
So some people are still getting away with it.
A lot of cases go unreported or they get dismissed as family matters, so the perpetrators escape justice.
It's like sweeping it under the rug.
And there's also a lack of trust in the legal system, especially among women.
Because they might be afraid to speak out against their families.
Exactly. They worry about the consequences.
So there's this gap between what the law says and what's actually happening.
And that shows how important it is to have a multi-pronged approach.
So not just focusing on legal reforms.
We need to address the root causes, the social and cultural norms that lead to violence against women.
So things like education, raising awareness about women's rights.
And empowering women to speak out against abuse and oppression.
Basically changing the whole narrative, right?
Shifting it from control and subjugation to respect, equality, and giving women agency over their own lives.
It's a huge task. And absolutely essential if we want to see real change.
It requires a complete transformation in how society views women and their role.
Both in the family and in the community.
Okay, so we've talked about honor killings in Pakistan.
Now let's bring it back to the U.S. context.
Back to Pavuluri's case.
What are some key takeaways from his story about how immigration is enforced here?
Well, it really exposes the weaknesses in our current system.
Like, what's the goal of punishment?
Is it about revenge or is it about helping people rehabilitate?
And how do we balance the rights of individuals, even those who've committed crimes?
With the need to keep the public safe.
It seems like we often just jump to the harshest punishment.
Without really thinking about the long-term consequences.
Or whether that person can change their life around.
And Pavuluri's case also shows how ICE operates in secrecy.
These mass deportation raids are often shrouded in mystery.
It's hard to know if they're even effective.
Or if they're being done fairly.
It's like a black box, no accountability, no way for the public to really see what's going on.
And make sure it aligns with our values.
That lack of transparency just creates distrust in the system.
Makes it harder to have open and honest conversations about immigration policy.
And how it impacts people and communities.
So we're talking about a system that needs serious reform.
In terms of how it enforces the rules and how transparent and accountable it is.
And that reform requires a shift in perspective.
Moving away from these policies based on fear.
Towards something more humane and equitable.
That recognizes everyone's inherent dignity.
Regardless of their immigration status.
It's a big goal, but it's something worth fighting for.
Definitely. Okay, I want to circle back to something we mentioned before.
What's that?
The role of social media in these cultural clashes.
It's like a two-sided coin.
On one hand, it can connect people from different cultures, promote understanding, and empathy.
But it can also make existing tensions worse, spread misinformation, and create echo chambers where prejudice and intolerance flourish,
It's like a global megaphone.
amplifying the good and the bad.
And in a world where information spreads so quickly,
It's more important than ever to be critical of what we see and hear online.
we can't just believe everything we read
We need to be aware of our own biases, have respectful conversations.
and be willing to challenge misinformation and hate speech whenever we see it,
It's about using our voices to promote understanding and tolerance.
even when we disagree with someone.
And remembering that the digital world isn't separate from the real world.
What we do online has real-world consequences.
We need to be responsible for how we interact with others in this virtual space.
That's a great point. These are all important things to keep in mind as we try to navigate this increasingly complex world.
Where everything is so interconnected.
And with that, I think we're going to wrap up part 2 of this deep dive.
Right. Sounds good.
Join us for the final part, where we'll try to put all this information together and leave you with some food for thought. All right, welcome back, everyone, for the last part of our deep dive.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We really have, from Harad Anwar's tragic death to the complexities of immigration in the U.S. with Sai Pavlouri's case.
Both stories really show how cultures clash in today's world.
Yeah, this globalized world we live in.
It's amazing how these two stories, which seem so different on the surface, actually end up touching on the same theme,
Right.
that struggle to balance individual freedoms with societal expectations and these deeply rooted cultural norms.
And that tension gets even bigger in a world where information spreads so fast.
Across borders, instantly.
I'm sure some of our listeners are feeling a little overloaded with all this information.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
So what are some of the key takeaways they should keep in mind?
Well, I think the biggest one is that cultural differences aren't inherently good or bad.
They just are.
Exactly. They just exist. And it's up to us to approach them with a willingness to understand.
Instead of judging or relying on stereotypes.
Because that just shuts down any chance of real conversation.
And just leads to more misunderstandings.
It's so easy to judge other cultures based on our own limited experiences.
It really is.
It takes effort to be empathetic and step outside our comfort zones.
To see things from another perspective.
Another important takeaway is recognizing the power dynamics at play in these cultural clashes.
So in both Hira's and Pavlouri's cases, we saw how imbalances of power can make things worse.
Yeah, whether it's within families or between individuals and institutions.
Leading to unfair outcome.
So like with Hira, you have a young girl trying to figure out who she is in American society, while also dealing with her family's expectations.
And with Pavlouri, as an immigrant on a student visa, he's up against the legal system that has a huge impact on his life.
It's not just about understanding different cultures.
It's about recognizing the systemic factors that create inequality.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, but what about solutions? What can people actually do to promote understanding and navigate these complex cultural intersections?
It feels like such a big question.
It is, but there are things we can do.
Like what?
Education is crucial. The more we learn about other cultures, the better we can understand them.
And treat them with respect.
And it's not just about reading books or watching documentaries.
It's about having real conversations with people from different backgrounds.
Listening to their experiences and challenging our own assumptions.
It's about building connections.
Finding common ground while celebrating our differences.
We can also support policies and practices that promote fairness and inclusion.
Whether that's backing organizations that help immigrants.
Or speaking out against discrimination and prejudice.
We all have a part to play in building a more just world.
It's a call to action. Being aware isn't enough.
We have to actually do something.
So to wrap things up, I think a good question for our listeners is this.
Yeah, let's leave them with something to think about.
How can we create spaces where different cultures can exist peacefully and respectfully while also protecting vulnerable people?
It's a question that deserves a lot of thought and reflection.
The answers aren't easy, but they start with a willingness to embrace complexity and try to understand each other better.
To strive for a world that's more just and understanding.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a heavy one, but an important one.
Remember, this journey of understanding never really ends.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the world around you.
We'll see you next time.